All right, welcome everyone to our second video in our video series on redistricting principles in Minnesota. If you are starting with this video, I do encourage you to go back and watch our introductory video just to get a sense of why we're working with these hexagons. But for everyone else, let's go ahead and jump in. The first principle we'll be talking about today is population equality. Now, the reason that I'm starting with population equality is because it's basically the reason, the principle that we have to do redistricting in the first place. Population equality is actually required by the US Constitution, that each political district must be relatively equal in population. It comes from the idea of one person, one vote. And after a census, we realized that populations have changed over the last 10 years. And so we have to adjust those districts to be equal in population based off of the population changes over the last decade. So here's a map of Hexland, where we have various census block groups. Again, each hexagon is a census block group. In this example, we have hexagons being filled with 100 people per hexagon. And we're creating 3 districts to hold all the people in Hexland. In order to create 3 districts in Hexland for this map, we have 3 districts of 4 hexagons or 400 people. Each district, which is outlined by the thick black lines, is 4 hexagons or 400 people. They're all equal. So that's how you would create equal population districts, is just ensuring that the number of people inside the district is equal to each other. Now, in the real world, you can see from this map that they're all perfectly equal, all exactly 400, because the hexagons, we've simplified everything so that they're all perfectly equal. Now, in the real world, congressional districts don't have to be necessarily perfectly equal. They have to be as nearly equal in population as practicable. Now, I do want to clarify a difference between practicable and possible, because that word practicable will come back later at another time. So I want to go over that now. It is possible, so I've created a couple of examples to help folks understand the difference between the 2 words. It is possible to take a helicopter to the grocery store, but that's not practicable. I mean, where would you park your helicopter? You'd have to get a helicopter, and that's expensive. You'd have to have a pilot, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Another example is it's possible to crawl to work every day, but that's not practicable. It would take a long time. Your pants would get dirty. You'd scuff up your hands. You'd get tired. It's not a good idea. So it is possible to crawl to work if you absolutely had to, but it's not practicable. So keep that in mind. Now, historically in Minnesota, our congressional districts have varied by only 1 person. So they have been as nearly as equal as possible. But it's not necessary to do it as equal as possible. For example, in Iowa, they created their congressional districts this last cycle, and they varied by several hundred people. So they were as nearly equal as practicable. Now, to be fair, that couple hundred people was a teeny tiny percentage of their population. The districts were over 500,000 people in each district. So it ended up being a very tiny percentage difference, but the difference was by more than just 1 or 2 people. It was several hundred people in variation. Now, legislative districts, which are the state, House, and Senate districts, are a slightly different role. They must be substantially equal. Now, substantially equal doesn't have a super clear definition, but the general rule, the shorthand, is that a 10% deviation from the ideal size would be considered substantially equal. So the ideal size of the previous example map that I provided a few moments ago, the ideal size was 400. And we were able to draw 3 districts that were 100% the ideal size. So there was no variation, but we could use some deviation of up to 10% if we needed to. So for example, if we were drawing 3 districts with 3,000 people total, 10%, the ideal size of each district would be 1,000 people, and 10% of that is 100. So we could vary by up to 100 per district. So one district could be 1,000 people, one district could be 900 people, one district could be 1,100 people, and that would be okay because that's all within the deviation of 10% deviation of the ideal size. You wouldn't want to go over 10% though, probably. It has been okay in a couple of circumstances, but the general rule is you need to stay under 10%. Now, again, Minnesota, being the overachieving state it is, we actually use a historical population deviation of less than 2%. So much less flexibility for what Minnesota's used in the past. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that you can have the same geographic map with the same number of districts and the same ideal populations and still draw different maps. So here I have that same map of Hexland we had a few slides ago, but here are two more variations of what that map could look like that still has 3 districts, and each district still has 400 people in each district. So that variation is important to note because you can have very different maps drawn, even though the districts, you have the same number of districts and equal population. And so I showed a couple of variations based off of our simplified version here in Hexland, but in the real world, if you were only using population equality, you could create thousands, if not millions upon millions of different maps to choose from with various districts that still had equal populations, but they just look differently on the map because the boundaries are different. And that's why we use these additional principles to draw our maps. We are able to narrow those options, and also by those principles allow us to make policy choices that can empower voters. And we'll get into more details in some of the other principles. Now, before we leave population equality, I do want to talk about one other piece of population equality, and that's population density. So in our last examples, each hexagon was the same population. Each hexagon was 100 people. But in reality, census block groups vary in population density. Some can be very dense because they're in urban areas, while some can be very sparsely populated because they're in rural areas. So I've created a new map here of Hexland. And in this version of Hexland, we actually have a large city that has 400 people in that hexagon. And we have a couple of smaller towns that have 200 people. But the plain hexagons still have 100 people in them. Now, our total population for Hexland is 1,800 people, and we're going to split it up into 3 districts again, which means our ideal district size is 600 people per district. And we need to draw those districts knowing that some of the hexagons have a different amount of people than other hexagons. So here I've given a couple examples of what those districts might mean. So you can see that the district with the city in it, it's smaller because more people live in one of those hexagons. So you need fewer hexagons to make it equal to the other hexagon, to the other districts. So we've got one district that has 3 hexagons, one district that has 4 hexagons, 2 of those being blank hexagons, 2 of those being towns, and then one district with 5 hexagons, with one of those hexagons being a town of 200 people. So you can see that even those districts have a different size geographically, physical, spatial size. They vary. They're still equal in population because you have to account for the fact that population density will mean that you need to adjust the number of hexagons or census blocks groups or whatever the geographical unit you're using to account for population size. And again, you'll also notice that they have I have 2 different examples, 2 variations of what those districts could look like, even though we have the same populations in the same places and the same number of districts. You can draw a couple of different variations of what that map should look like in order to achieve population density. Still lots of variety there. So even though population density does affect how those maps are drawn, you'll still have some variation. So to review population equality, Each district must be nearly or substantially the same population size as all the other districts when you're drawing these districts. You should note that population density means that some districts might have very small shape, but still be an equal population to districts with very large shapes because they have higher population density. And different maps can be drawn even though each map has the same number of districts with the same population. And that's why we have to use the other redistricting principles when we're drawing our maps. So that's a quick summary of population equality. I hope you will join us for our next video in this series, which will talk about minority representation.